The diesel cough from the engine swallowed the world for a moment. Then the hull answered with a metallic heartbeat that matched the rhythm behind my own ribs. We had rolled into the mud before dawn, a squat iron thing with a gun like a cathedral bell. And I remember thinking, with the kind of certainty that belongs to men who have seen too much and hope for less, that the ISU 152 was less a machine and more a verdict. We called it the Zveroboy, sometimes among ourselves, beast killer, in a language that made the name sound both proud and haunted. That day I was the loader, a job that kept my hands busy and my mouth quieter than the others, because the loader touches powder and steel, and, for a few seconds each shot, the whole crew shares a single, terrible intimacy with the metal monster that carries them. The through line of my memory is simple. How that gun, a 152mm howitzer bolted onto a heavy chassis, set the tempo of our lives. Every order, every movement, every small survival choice bent toward getting that tube to speak, and survive long enough to speak again. We had been awake for hours before the sun showed itself, not from excitement, but from a relentless, necessary nervousness that keeps men alive. The cold tasted like old metal on my tongue. Outside, the world had been chewed by shellfire, and the fields had taken a gray, memorized look, as if someone had painted over color so no one would remember a summer. Inside the ISU 152, we were a tangle of nerves and habits. The driver kept his hands on the levers like a violinist. The commander scanned with a pair of binoculars that had the same permanent sheen as his knuckles. The gunner muttered numbers under his breath, and I rifled through shells, feeling the balance of each round, as if it were an argument between life and death. We were supposed to punch a hole in a fortified line where infantry and engineers could pour through. The plan read like many plans do, simple in ink, savage in soil. The ISU 152 had been designed to treat bunkers and armor the same way, with a blunt, undeniable statement of force. Our crew had learned a few truths by rote. First, the recoil was not merely something you felt. It was a physical hand that knocked the air out of you and rearranged your internal furniture. Second, we carried only a handful of those heavy rounds, because the thing we carried to thunder bombs into stone could not carry a great many of them. Third, once fired, the beast took time to breathe. Reload cycles were measured not in seconds so much as in the length of the commander's patience. The first hidden gem I remember noticing, in the hush between engines and the distant ringing of artillery, was how the 152mm was more forgiving against armor at distance than it was against reality up close. Germans would learn to hate that gun not because it was precise, but because it delivered such catastrophic impact that tracks and turrets became optional suggestions. They would also adapt by using angled earthworks and rubble to make approach routes treacherous, and we had to respect that cunning. Another thing we carried like a prayer was the chassis itself, borrowed in a sense from earlier heavy tanks, a compromise of production economies that gave the ISU 152 its reliability but also its size. It was big, and big things cast long shadows on the battlefield, which is to say it revealed itself to attentive enemies before it arrived. When we rolled forward the first time, the world shrank to a sequence of focused tasks. The commander found a target and spoke in clipped phrases. The gunner adjusted, breathed, and pressed a hand into his cheek, as if soothing a wild animal. The loader, me, felt each shell as it scraped down the bustle rack and thought briefly of home, of a small town where the factory whistles had once set the clock. We crawled into position, and the earth itself seemed to recoil at the weight of us. The enemy fortifications sat like teeth in the landscape, cold and deliberate. The first shot went off like an alarm bell. The noise was a private apocalypse. There is a particular way a 152mm round announces itself. A pressure wave that lights the ears, a flash that paints the interior of the turret for a breath, and the recoil that rocks the table where the crew sits. For a second, everything in me locked into the gun's mechanics. Seatbelts catching, shell ramming home. The smell of burning powder filling the tiny space. After the first shock, the silence was not empty. It was full of small, frightened sounds, a muttered curse, the clack of a loose bolt settling, the driver's voice reporting broken earth under the tracks. We had knocked a slit into the enemy's lines, and for a brief, bright time our infantry sprinted through like boys who had been given a map to a hidden river. Pressure builds in war the same way it does in a kettle, unseen and then roiling. The Germans countered. Armor came out from behind wood and iron, their silhouettes smaller and quicker than ours, and anti-tank guns began to chew the air. The ISU 152 was never meant to chase a panzer down the road. It was meant to take shots from distance, to batter concrete and the guts of heavy armor with explosive force. But war is practical, and we found ourselves in a game of cat and mouse, each move stretching the limits of the machine and the men. The second hidden gem I learned that day was the cost of traverse. The gargantuan gun sat forward with limited left-right movement, and to aim at anything beyond its arc, we had to pivot the whole vehicle, which meant exposing the weaker side of our armor to keen German gunners. That compromise shaped how we fought more than any doctrine. Our climax came in a handful of minutes that lasted like an hour. An enemy tank hunter lifted its gun and sent an iron whisper toward us. The round clipped our front glasses and sparked a score along the hull. The shock of metal and the taste of dust filled the air. The commander barked, and the driver tried to reposition, but time had found a way to be particular. The 152mm was due for reload. I remember the gunner's face as he calculated where to send the next scream of metal, and I remember thinking that a single correct aim could end more than a fight. It could make a whole company breathe again. I slammed the next round home, feeling the weight of it as if it bore the faces of the men who trusted us. When it left the muzzle, the recoil flattened us, and the world tore itself a little open. What came after the shot was a small miracle, wrapped in rubble and smoke. The enemy's anti-tank gun folded inward, as if someone had pulled a jaw. The nearby bunker buckled and threw debris like confetti from a funeral parade. We were not glamorous. There was no triumphant music, just a quartet of men who had done a job with an instrument of awesome, terrible specificity. The enemy reacted with a kind of precision born of necessity, counter-battery, smoke, and then the prudence of retreat. The ISU 152 had obliged us with its thunder, but victory was not a place. It was a series of tiny survivals strung up like beads. There was an aha in the quiet that followed, a revelation that felt almost indecent in its simplicity. The ISU 152 was as much psychology as it was steel. Its presence altered how the enemy arranged defenses, how friendly infantry moved, how commanders recalibrated risk. It forced decisions out of men who preferred not to be forced. That day I saw, sharp and long, how a single heavy gun could create openings not only on the map, but in the enemy's mind. To be in the turret was to be in the center of that force field, aware that you were both a tool and a provocateur. After, when the adrenaline thinned and the smoke became background, we counted casualties and shells. We had wounded men to help and a machine with a busted track to drag out of the mud. The third hidden gem I carried away was practical and bitter. Logistics could kill as surely as enemy fire. Heavy rounds ate space, time, and men. Supply lines that ran with precision, in theory, often stumbled on weather and weight. We limped back to a forward park where other ISU 152s sat, like an armored herd, each carrying its own grief and stories of missed shots and fortunate escapes. We cleaned weapons by rote, tied down spare tracks, and shared a piece of hard bread that tasted like victory, or maybe merely like survival. The sense of meaning that lingered was not heroic in a tidy way. The ISU 152 mattered because it allowed other men to live another day, to step through the breach it made and fight in ways small and human. It also mattered because it required a kind of commitment, of crew cohesion, of logistics, and of audacity, that revealed the larger cost of war. By the time night fell, the fields had taken back their colors, and our tracks had already started to freeze into the earth. We slept in shifts, exhausted by the machine's physical demands and by what it implied. That no matter how many fortifications it broke, there would always be another day and another embrasure to hammer. Years later, the memory surfaces not as a set of technical points, but as the smell of burnt powder and the intimacy of 4 men sharing 8 cubic meters of metal and fate. The ISU 152 was a blunt instrument and a precise threat. It reshaped how battles were approached and how men thought about risk. It taught me that a weapon can be both a lifeline and a sentence, that heavy ordnance decides not only ground but psychology. When I close my eyes, I still see the flash in the turret and hear the rib-rattling recoil. I also see the faces of the ones who sprinted through the hole we made, and I remember that our thunder bought them seconds and chances. That is why it mattered. Not because the gun was loud, but because, for a few ragged moments, it turned the future into something we could seize, even if only for the length of a breath. If you enjoyed this, tap like and subscribe. It really helps. And drop a quick comment telling us where you're watching from. The United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or anywhere else in the world. Your reply helps the video reach more people just like you.